Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I am not going to pretend I handled it with grace in the moment, because what actually happened was that I stared at my phone with that tight, prickly feeling behind my eyes you get when you are trying very hard not to cry in public. And I reread my mom's text that said they could not make my marathon because it was just too much and they would be cheering from home. And then, about 5 minutes later, my thumb refreshed the feed and there it was, a cheerful photo from my sister's favorite spot. Mimosas held high, caption about family time and self-care, and the kind of hashtags she always uses when she is trying to show the world that her life is the standard everyone should be measuring against, which would have been annoying on any other weekend. But on this morning it felt like someone had bumped the table right as I was lifting the glass to my mouth and then laughed when it spilled. I had done the training the boring way, the way that does not look like much on a grid of squares and circles, the slow early mornings before work when the sidewalks are mostly empty and the mind wants to negotiate for another 10 minutes of sleep. The long runs on Saturdays that devour your day even when you plan perfectly, the care with meals and the stretching and the ridiculous little routines that sound obsessive until the miles start adding up and you realize the routine is what keeps the wheels on, and I had paid for it too, because when you are a normal person with a normal job, something has to give, and for me it was a lot of social life and a couple of family dinners where I showed up late, sweaty, and not fun. Which my sister never failed to point out with those sweet digs she has perfected, the ones that sound like a compliment until the end of the sentence, and I kept telling myself that it would all feel different when they saw me at the finish, because there is something about seeing your people in the crowd that makes the hard parts make sense. The plan we agreed on was simple and kind of standard. They would be at the finish, because parking is easier to handle if you are not the one running, and they would track me on the app, and if they wanted to pop to a mid-course spot they could. But mostly I just wanted to know I would hear their voices when it got loud near the end and someone would put a jacket on me when the metal felt heavier than it should, and to be fair, when I first told them months ago, they were enthusiastic in that shiny way people are when they think your big goal will be a nice story to tell at parties. But as race week got close, the tone shifted, because my sister had some new thing going on that required attention. And my dad started talking about traffic, and my mom started sighing about the early hour and the crowd, and I had this sinking feeling I have had since childhood. The one that says you already know which way this is going, so do not act surprised when the coin lands the same side up. When my mom's message came in the night before, I screenshotted it and then deleted the screenshot because I did not want to be the person who hoards exhibits just to wave them around later, and I told myself, fine, life happens, maybe they really cannot. Maybe this is not about me, and then the morning arrived and my phone showed me the bloody brunch like a punchline, and if I sound bitter it is because the kind of favoritism that gets normalized in a family wears a groove into your brain, and you start telling yourself it is safer not to ask for things because then you cannot be disappointed, and I decided in that exact second that I would not text them, I would not call. I would not ask for an explanation or an apology that would come with an addendum about how I am being dramatic. I would let them enjoy their day exactly as they had planned, and I would run my race exactly as I had planned. People always expect some speech about dignity and taking the high road, but the truth is simpler and a little uglier, because what I felt was fuel, a low, steady burn that said, fine, if the choice is between being sad and being focused, I will choose focused. And as I moved toward the start, I rehearsed the version of the day where I finish without their faces in the crowd and I keep my head straight and I do not stumble into that childish craving for acknowledgement that never pays off anyway. And somewhere in that rehearsal another thought arrived, one that felt both petty and exactly right, which was that if they did not care to be part of the story, I would make sure they heard it anyway, just not privately. Not in the little family group chat where my sister performs and my parents applaud, but out loud in a way they could not spin. I am not proud of how much that thought kept me upright through the first miles, and I am also not sorry, because marathons are honest. And there is nothing more honest than the realization that the people you keep trying to impress are perfectly comfortable not showing up, and if I was going to carry that weight, I might as well turn it into a plan. So I made a tiny adjustment that seemed minor at the time and turned out to be the first step towards something bigger, because I opened the race. App that lets you customize the little line of text under your bib name for people who track you, and I replaced the cheerful quote I had picked with a short message that said, in plain language and without names, that this one was for the people who stayed home. And then I saved it and I closed the phone and I felt that click in my chest that happens when indecision finally shuts up. If you are wondering whether I worried about blowing up my relationship with my family, the answer is yes and no, because on one level I did not want to be that person who drags private issues into public, but on another, I was tired of the private conversations that go nowhere, the ones where I soften my words so much that nothing is left but a shrug, and I decided that I would run, and if at the end there was a camera and a question, I would not waste the chance to say something that would finally land. And if there was no camera, then the app would be enough, and if neither happened, well, I would still have the finish, which nobody could take away. By the time we were herded into the corrals and the speakers blasted the countdown I did not really hear, I had already made peace with the fact that my family had made their choice, and I had made mine, and I promised myself I would not text them during the race. I would not look for their names along the fence. I would pay attention to my pace and my breath and that little message under my bib, and when the tracker started pinging and friends from work began sending me those little good luck notes that pop up like reminders, I felt steady, because I knew I had taken back a sliver of control, and I knew, even before the first step, that if they were not going to show up for me, I would make sure they would hear me loud and clear anyway, and not in the way they expected. The thing about a long race that nobody tells you when they are busy selling you inspirational nonsense is that the miles do not just test your body, they test your story about yourself. And with every timing mat I crossed, I could feel the familiar family script tugging at me like an old sweater you keep meaning to throw away. The one that says be understanding, be flexible, be the one who makes room. Because that is what you have always done when your sister's needs arrive with sirens and my parents move like a pit crew around her latest crisis, while I nod and tell myself that love means patience, and I could hear that script, and I let it talk for a while. And then somewhere past the halfway mark I told it to sit down because I had given it enough airtime in my life, and today it could watch me run without offering notes. When the tracker buzzed my wrist, and the little supportive messages from coworkers and friends found me in those brief pockets where your brain clears, I felt this steadying calm that did not come from any gel or sports drink or whatever coaches recommend. It came from a plain truth I had been avoiding for years, which was that I had built a life with habits that made me reliable to everyone but myself, and every step today was a small refusal to keep doing that, so I let the anger simmer. Without letting it poison me, I let it fuel me the way a tiny pilot light sits there doing its job, and as I moved I kept replaying those old moments that make up a pattern. Like the college graduation where my parents arrived late because my sister's dog had a stomach issue and my mother told me not to be dramatic about a ceremony that would be forgotten by Monday. Or the job promotion dinner where my father spent half the night asking my sister about her plans and then, as we stood by the door, clapped me on the shoulder like a boss trying to look supportive in a movie, and if you think I am cataloging slights for sport, I promise I wish I were not, but patterns are stubborn and today, I finally let myself call them what they were. There is a point late in a race when your body starts negotiating hard and your mind looks for any excuse to ease up, and that was exactly when I saw a cluster of media vests near a barricade as the course curved toward the finish area. And it was like the universe had underlined an opportunity with a thick pen, because I knew from years of watching local coverage that they wanted quick sound bites and human interest, and if I looked like I had a story, they would stick a microphone in my face. And for once I would not hand them the tidy version where I thank my family and talk about perseverance, as if I learned it from people who could not be bothered to show up. So I decided that if I crossed that line upright and coherent, I would head straight for the mixed zone and I would not flinch if someone tried to redirect me, because sometimes gatekeepers count on you being too polite to insist, and I have been too polite my whole life. A friend from my running group had promised to be near the finish with a spare phone battery and a loud voice, and when I heard her call my name I felt this surge of grateful defiance, because there are people who will show up without being begged. And those people deserve acknowledgement, so I waved at her, and she shouted that I looked strong and that the time on the clock did not matter because the story would, and I laughed in that ungraceful way you laugh when your lungs are making their own choices, and I knew that she understood me better than my parents ever had, which sounds cruel and maybe it is, but it is also honest, and honesty is the only thing that kept my stride from falling apart. As I entered the last stretch, the crowd noise thickened into that mush of voices that usually melts into a blur. But this time I heard specific words because a volunteer with a handheld camera yelled that local news was picking finishers for interviews and did I want to talk, and in another life I would have waved them off, worried about looking foolish. Worried about saying something that would create drama I would then have to manage in the family chat, but in this life, in this late mile, where the old script had finally caved, I raised my hand like a student who knows the answer and I said I have something to say, and I meant it in a way that made the volunteer's eyebrows rise because most people at that point are busy trying to breathe, not auditioning for the evening segment. I crossed the line and kept moving because if you stop entirely your body files a formal complaint, and a woman with a press badge gestured me toward a small taped area where a couple of other runners were giving cheerful quotes about community and resilience. And for a second I felt that old reflex to play nice, to make everyone comfortable, to shrink my point into a throwaway joke that would let my parents off the hook, and then I pictured that brunch photo again, the clinking glasses, the caption about family time, the comments from my mother's friends who love to call my sister radiant, and the reflex dissolved like a sugar cube underwater, and I stood a little taller because if I was going to take the heat, I might as well enjoy the warmth. The reporter was young but professional in that brisk local way, and she asked the standard opener about how it felt to finish, and I gave her one honest sentence about how it felt like the right day to stop apologizing for wanting support. And she blinked in that quick calculation you can see when someone realizes there is more here, and then she asked the real question, the one that tees up thank yous and shout-outs and heartwarming montages, and I could feel the whole messy history of my family line up behind my teeth, and I knew that I could let it spill out in a way that would make me sound unhinged, or I could choose a handful of words that would carry the weight without dragging me into a pit I could not climb out of. And for once I trusted myself to pick the right version. If you want to call what happened next revenge, I will not argue, because it was the measured, undeniable kind that does not require a single raised voice, and it began not with a scream, but with a choice to use a public moment for a private truth. So when she lifted the microphone closer and asked who I wanted to thank for supporting me, I leaned in with the calm you get after a hard sprint, and I prepared to dedicate my win to everyone who stayed home, because if my parents were comfortable choosing brunch over my finish, then they could be comfortable hearing themselves in that sentence on the evening news, and that thought, held steady and simple, was exactly what carried me as the red light on the camera flicked on and the reporter nodded for me to speak. The microphone was close enough that I could see a faint smudge on its windscreen, and the camera's red light was steady, and the reporter was giving me that polite, expectant look that people in her position learn to master, the one that invites you to give a nice, safe answer that can slot neatly between a human interest piece about a local dog parade and a weather update, and I knew with absolute clarity that I was not about to give her anything safe, because this was the exact kind of opening I had been waiting for without even realizing it, the kind that you cannot manufacture or plan down to the second, the kind you either step into fully or regret forever, so I leaned in. Not with aggression, but with a steadiness that I hoped would make every word land without the cushion of a joke or a deflection. She had just asked who I wanted to thank for supporting me, and I could feel my throat tighten with that particular mix of exhaustion and adrenaline that comes when your body knows it has done something hard and your mind is still catching up. But I did not pause to overthink or soften it, I just let the sentence roll out in one clean shot. I want to dedicate this win to everyone who stayed home today. There was a split second where I could see her processing the words, maybe wondering if she had misheard me, maybe considering whether to follow up, but she kept her smile in place because live TV does not give you room to unravel awkward moments. And she moved to the next question, as if she had not just been handed a grenade wrapped in polite phrasing. I answered that next question with something generic about perseverance, because the point had already been made, and when she thanked me for my time and I stepped away, I could feel the heat of what I had just done, not in the sense of embarrassment or panic, but in the quiet certainty that this one sentence was going to do more than any sit-down conversation or carefully worded text ever could, because it was public, it was clean, and it was unarguably true without naming a single person. I collected my finisher's medal, walked through the recovery area with a bottle of water, and while people around me were checking their watches or hugging their families, I was picturing my parents at home, maybe still lingering over coffee. Maybe scrolling through their phones, maybe catching my interview on the evening replay, and I wondered how long it would take before someone connected the dots for them. By the time I made it back to my bag drop and switched my phone off airplane mode, the messages had already started trickling in. A coworker's, "Did you just say what I think you said?" followed by a friend's laughing, "I love you," and a screenshot from someone who had paused their TV to capture my face mid-sentence. There was a giddy energy in me that had nothing to do with finishing the marathon, a kind of sharp satisfaction that comes when you finally say the thing you have been swallowing for years, and I scrolled through those first reactions without replying, letting them pile up while I cooled down and tried to stretch my legs enough to avoid seizing up entirely. It wasn't until I was on the train home, medal tucked into my bag, that I saw the first real sign that the interview had started to spread. A local running group's Facebook page had posted the clip with the caption, "Ouch," but kind of iconic, and the comments were already in the hundreds, with strangers dissecting whether I was talking about unsupportive friends, an absent partner, or, as one particularly perceptive commenter put it, family who can show up for brunch but not for you. I didn't comment. I didn't clarify, I didn't need to, because the ambiguity was doing the work for me, and the people who knew the truth were already in the right position to feel its sting. When I finally got home, the first notification I saw after dropping my bag was from my sister. Not a call but a text, and it was short in that clipped way she uses when she's trying not to show that she's rattled. Wow. Classy. I didn't reply. I didn't need to ask what she meant, because we both knew she had seen the interview, and we both knew that brunch photo was still sitting on her feed, bright and cheerful and time-stamped exactly during the hours I was running. Not long after, my mother's name lit up my phone, and I let it go to voicemail, because I already knew the message would be some mix of, "We didn't mean it like that," and "You're making us look bad." And I had no interest in giving her the chance to turn my sentence into a problem I had to fix. What struck me most, as I sat on my couch sipping the first coffee of the day that I could actually enjoy, was how easy it had been in the end, not the marathon, which had been grueling in the way only marathons are, but the act of finally saying something that cut straight through years of excuses and deflections. No yelling, no names, no messy confrontation that could be dismissed as me overreacting, just a single, deliberate line that I knew they would hear no matter how fast they tried to scroll past it. By evening, the clip had been shared by a couple of local news blogs, and the comment threads had taken on a life of their own. Some people defended me outright, some speculated wildly about the backstory, and a surprising number of strangers seemed to feel personally validated by it, as if my sentence had voiced something they had wanted to say to their own absent supporters. I didn't feed the speculation, I didn't add context, I just let it run, because every hour that passed without me backpedaling made it harder for anyone to dismiss it as a slip of the tongue. And somewhere between my third and fourth replay of the clip, I realized I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, not in the sense of damage or regret, but in the sense of finally accepting that some relationships are not waiting to be repaired. They are waiting to be acknowledged for what they actually are. I didn't know exactly how my parents or my sister would respond beyond the texts they'd already sent, but I did know one thing. The sting from those 8 words was not going to fade quickly, and that was exactly the point. The next morning started before I was ready for it, not because of any alarm I had set, but because the vibration of my phone on the nightstand was relentless, a steady stream of notifications that I eventually gave in to checking, only to find that the clip from the interview had spread much further overnight than I had anticipated, crossing out of the local news bubble into wider social circles where people I hadn't spoken to in years were tagging me or sending private messages that carried a mix of congratulations, curiosity, and in some cases a kind of conspiratorial approval that told me they understood exactly what I had meant without needing a single extra word of explanation. My inbox was flooded with variations of "that was legendary," and "you said what needed to be said," and while I had expected some degree of reaction, the sheer scale of it made it clear that I had struck a nerve far beyond my own small family drama. Scrolling through the tags, I noticed that the post from the local running group had racked up thousands of comments, and within those threads, my sister's now infamous brunch photo had become a focal point, with people reposting screenshots, zooming in on the timestamp, and openly drawing connections between my sentence and the image of her clinking glasses while I was somewhere between mile 8 and mile 10, fighting through the ache in my legs. The comments weren't kind, and while part of me might have once flinched at the idea of her being publicly criticized, I found myself reading them with a detached clarity, as though I were simply observing a predictable consequence rather than witnessing some unfortunate misunderstanding. It was not lost on me that for years, the unspoken rule had been that I absorbed the sting of her actions quietly, never pushing back in a way that might embarrass her. But this time, the embarrassment was not mine to carry, and I had no intention of stepping in to soften the blow. By mid-morning, the text messages from her had escalated from sarcastic jabs to outright demands, each one more frantic than the last. "You need to clarify this. People are making assumptions." Then, "This is getting out of hand. Tell them it wasn't about me." And finally, "If you don't fix this, you're dead to me." I read them all without replying, not because I didn't have the words, but because I knew that any response would hand her an opening to reframe the situation in a way that would allow her to claim victimhood, and I wasn't about to give her that foothold. The silence, I knew, was more infuriating to her than anything I could have said. It didn't take long for my parents to join in. My mother called 3 times before I let it go to voicemail, and when I finally listened, her tone was sharp and clipped, the kind of voice she used when she believed she was speaking from a position of moral authority. She said she was disappointed in me for airing private grievances in public, as if my sentence had been some breach of loyalty rather than a factual statement. My father's message was shorter, but no less pointed. He told me I had crossed a line and should think about the damage I was doing to the family's image. The irony of that phrasing didn't escape me, given that they had thought nothing of posting smiling brunch photos while I was running the race they had promised to attend. But what happened next was the part that made me realize just how rattled my sister was. Sometime around noon, I went back to check the brunch post, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see how she was handling the influx of attention, and I noticed something immediately different. The comment count had dropped drastically, and on closer inspection, I saw that every single comment referencing the marathon, my interview, or the obvious overlap in timing had been deleted. She had kept the praise, the emojis, the generic, gorgeous as always fluff, but the ones calling out her absence, the ones asking why she hadn't been at the race, were gone. In their place was a note she'd pinned to the top: "Some people are making false assumptions. Please keep this space positive." That was the moment I knew she wasn't just irritated, she was panicking. My sister has always thrived on public approval, curating her image like it's her full-time job, and the fact that she had resorted to scrubbing her own feed told me she understood exactly how bad it looked, even if she'd never admit it out loud. And while I might have once been tempted to reach out and smooth things over, to make her feel better, I didn't even entertain the thought this time. The truth was, she had made her choice when she clinked that glass at brunch instead of standing at the finish line, and now she was living with the fallout. Throughout the day, I kept seeing my sentence resurface in different contexts, people quoting it on Twitter, using it in memes, even turning it into a slogan on a running forum where they shared their own stories of being unsupported by people who were supposed to care. It was surreal, watching something that had started as a personal, pointed moment become part of a larger conversation, but it was also strangely affirming. For years, I had been told, sometimes gently, sometimes sharply, that my feelings were overreactions, that I was too sensitive, that I was imagining slights where none existed. Now, here was a tidal wave of strangers who understood exactly what I meant without needing the family history to decode it. By evening, the group chat with my parents and sister had gone silent, which in our family is never a sign of peace, but a sign of retreat, the quiet that comes when they're regrouping to figure out a strategy. I knew there would be more to come, attempts to spin it, to reframe me as the aggressor, to guilt me into retracting something I hadn't even explicitly said about them, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing myself for the fight. Instead, I felt a steady, settled calm, because the truth was already out there in the simplest possible form, and no amount of comment deletion or damage control could put it back in the box. And as I put my phone down that night, letting it buzz itself into the corner while I made dinner, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer my sister could hold out before she realized that deleting the evidence wasn't going to change the fact that everyone had already seen it. I woke up the next day with the kind of headache that comes from too much adrenaline and not enough food, and while I was trying to talk myself into stretching rather than limping to the kitchen, a message from the reporter slid into my inbox with a polite note about follow-up coverage and a request for a longer interview, which would have been flattering in a different week, but felt like a setup for another round of family theater where I either softened my sentence to make everyone comfortable or doubled down in a way that would keep the fire burning longer than I wanted. So I thanked her, told her I was proud of the race, and said that I would prefer to keep the focus on running rather than turn my personal life into a segment, and then, because the universe seems to reward clarity, a very different note showed up from the owner of the brunch place, who wrote that he had no idea his dining room had been dragged into anything, that he hoped I would not hold it against his staff, and that if there was any way the restaurant could make something right, he would listen. It would have been easy to lash out or ask for some performative apology, but standing in my kitchen with my legs reminding me what I had done, I realized that what I actually wanted was not an apology from a stranger, but a way to turn a petty refusal into something with weight, something that could not be rewritten in the group chat or cleaned up by my sister's delete key. So I wrote back and said he owed me nothing, and then I asked for something simple and public that no one could spin as spite, which was a small fundraiser table by the host's stand for a local youth running program, with a little sign that said, without names or hashtags, that it was dedicated to everyone who stayed home, and if he would match the first day's donations, I would stop by, smile, and leave it there. To his credit, he agreed within the hour, and by afternoon the restaurant's Instagram posted a sober square with a caption about community support and showing up for people in ways that count, and a picture of a small donation jar with my sentence on the card. And I did not have to tag my sister or my parents, because the internet did the math for them, which meant that my quiet request had turned my one sharp line into a banner for something good without a single insult or a single edit to the truth. Friends sent me screenshots, coworkers tossed a few dollars into the jar on their lunch break, and I walked over near closing, thanked the owner, and signed a plain card for the program coordinator with a note about how a lot of kids will grow up believing they need to earn a seat at the table, and how it helps to have a lane that is theirs no matter who shows up with a camera. Predictably, my sister exploded. She called my move manipulative and cruel. She wrote a paragraph about bullying and pile-ons, and then she deleted that too when the replies started pointing out that nobody had named her, and that if the shoe fit. Maybe it was because she had picked it out herself, and somewhere after her fourth attempt to rewrite the story, my mother called with that high-pitched composure she uses when she is trying to sound reasonable, telling me that I was turning family matters into public campaigns, that I was using charity as a weapon, and that a good daughter would have kept the grievance inside the house, at which point I said the part one had never said out loud in any kitchen or car, which was that the house had not felt like a house to me for a very long time because the rules only applied when they kept my sister comfortable, and that I would not be taking down anything or recanting any sentence, because facts do not bend just because someone is embarrassed by them. I could feel her preparing the old closing argument about gratitude and respect, so I cut in and told her I was making one final adjustment to the script, and I meant it, because while all of this had started with a line on live television, it would end with something quieter and more permanent, which was a boundary they could not delete, and I told her that for the next year I would not be attending family events where my presence was treated like a placeholder until my sister arrived, that I would not be responding to group texts that were just stage directions for her spotlight, and that if anyone wanted to talk to me, they could do it directly without the audience. And then I said I loved them, but I loved my sanity more. And I hung up before she could declare me dramatic, because I have heard that word tossed at me since childhood, and it has never helped a single thing. The fundraiser post kept rolling. The running program sent a thank you message with a picture of kids at a track. And the restaurant owner texted that they had decided to make the jar permanent because the conversation at the host stand had been warmer and kinder than his comment section. And in a quiet moment that afternoon, I opened my own feed and posted a single photo of my medal on the table next to the donation card, with a caption that did not gloat or sting, just a sentence about how some wins are loud and some wins are a jar that fills slowly, and I tagged the program and the restaurant and left my family unnamed because I am not interested in perpetual court. I am interested in leverage that does not require a raised voice. Some people will say I went too far, and some will say I should have done it years ago, and the truth is I have thought both of those things at different hours of the night. But here is what settled it for me. For the first time in a long time, I was not waiting by my phone for an apology that would never arrive, and I was not working to manage a narrative that had always left me looking like the difficult one. Because the sentence and the jar and the boundary had done the work for me, and even if my sister's comments disappeared overnight and my mother tried to reset the board with the same old lines, the game had changed. I am not naive enough to think a single race and a single sentence fix a whole childhood of patterns, but I am clear on this much. I took a moment they expected me to swallow and turned it into something they could not ignore. And while there is a part of me that still wants their understanding, there is a larger part that finally understands myself, which is why, when the next race email landed and asked whether I wanted a line under my bib, I typed out the same words without hesitation, knowing that I had already delivered the only finish that mattered, and that no matter what they choose to say or erase, the final move was mine, clean, simple, and impossible to take back.